Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's always a blessing to be with you. We are continuing our study through the book of Exodus. Here, as always, with me is Dr. Justin Smith.
Good to be here.
We are looking at the last of the 10 plagues and then Egypt's escape from Israel. We talked a little bit about the Passover last week, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth in that as we begin. Passover is something that honestly is somewhat troubling and should make us really think about God's holiness and God's requirement as we discussed God's justice. Like, what does it look like for us to seek God's justice in the world? How do you know you're on the right side? There's some complexity there that's hard. And then I think something that is interesting in moving out of this is the specifics of the celebration of Passover. Yeah. The other plagues, there's sometimes 2 or 3 in a chapter, but in Exodus, the Passover story and then the leaving takes 3 chapters. There's a lot there. And part of that is just very specific instructions about what this is to look like, how it is that you're supposed to celebrate. The blood is supposed to be on the doorpost, like all of these things that are part of this story. Just an example, in Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 11, "These are your instructions for eating this meal. Be fully dressed. Wear your sandals and carry your walking stick in your hand. Eat the meal with urgency, for this is the Lord's Passover. On that night I will pass through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn son and every firstborn male animal in the land of Egypt. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. But put the blood on your doorposts that will serve as a sign, marking the houses where you're staying. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. The plague of death will not touch you when I strike the land of Egypt. This is the day to remember. Each year from generation to generation, you must celebrate it as a special festival to the Lord. This is the law for all time. For 7 days, the bread you eat must be made without yeast. On the first day of the festival, remove every trace of yeast from your homes. Anyone who eats bread made with yeast during the 7 days of the festival will be cut off from the community of Israel. On the first day of the festival, and again on the 7th day, all the people must observe an official day for holy assembly. No work of any kind may be done on these except in the preparation of food." So there's all of this information that is very, very specific. Be fully dressed while you're doing this. Walk with a walking stick. And what I think is interesting about many of these early books in the Old Testament, as God is trying to establish and identify a people, it's the specifics of it. Like, okay, you're going to do this, and on the 3rd day you're going to do that, and you can't do this, you can't do that. And anybody who thinks perhaps that religion or this God stuff is boring, really it's party planning. I mean, it's like very specific. Drink this and celebrate this, remember this, and tell the oldest person will tell this story, and all of these things that are specific about this is how you are to remember who you are. And I think it's so profound to think about this idea that God gives them like a party planning guide basically and says, stop during this month and take a week and celebrate and do all of this. And as I read this, I think of how in our world, like there's not a whole lot of room for this. Like it's not the way that we live, especially in the U.S. It's just faster and faster. Yeah. I remember reading an article that came out in the early 90s about this technology that was coming called email. And once everyone got an email address, the work week was going to be just 20 hours a week because you're just going to be so much more efficient and everything's going to get done like so quickly. You're going to be able to like just speed through your work week. And that hasn't happened. It hasn't come through for us, unfortunately. And I just think the treadmill just gets faster and faster. And in a lot of ways, we live in a rhythmless society where every day, I mean, especially during COVID, but every day feels like every other day. Yeah. And as I look at some of these things, like this is the festival, this is how you're supposed to remember, I think we struggle to slow down and pause. And I think we need to reclaim some of this, obviously not the same exact festivals, but I think we need some ways that we have some rhythm in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, part of this is interesting too, is the way that this description is anticipating what's going to happen. My translation says, gird up your loins.
Yeah.
Take the long part of your garment and pull it up. Get ready to go. So you're eating this meal on the hoof, man. Like you got your sandals on, you're ready to go. All of this is going to happen quickly. When the angel of death comes and, men, women, children, animals, livestock in Egypt are killed, they are going to be ready for you to go. So if you stay ready, you won't have to get ready.
Yeah.
Do these things, and it becomes the Passover and all of these intricacies and these symbols and these moments, the blood on the doorpost, this sign of this animal died for this household, right? The way that death and sin comes together and all of this really powerful and lingering imagery, right? But then this becomes a key part of the national identity, the national narrative. It's who we are. It's who Israelites are. It's who Hebrews are as a people. We celebrate this, and we celebrate it in this way. And we celebrate it in this way to remember this moment, because this moment is definitive of who we are, right? And I think for many of us, we struggle to have those definitive elements of who we are. We look at many of the rites and rituals of Christianity and the church, and more often than not, it feels like we want to push back against them. We want to challenge them. And challenge is okay. I'm not against challenge. You know me. Challenge is good at points, but how often do we lean into these things and say, this is what is definitive of us, or these are things that are definitive of us as a people. And I mean, Sunday, our Sabbath, right? Our day of rest. I mean, what does that actually look like? How restful is Sunday? Or is Sunday the day that we do all the stuff we couldn't do during the week to get ready for the next week? Holidays now, Christmas and some of these other holidays used to feel like week-long celebrations, and now it's some time off with family, and then you work a few more days, and a little more time off, and then you're back to work. I guess I was not nearly as hopeful about what email was going to do for us as some. I feel like all it does is it makes it so we do twice as much work in the same amount of time. So I guess that's productivity. But I think the point that you make about rhythms, I mean, the rhythms of sort of the earth fit so much more comfortably in agrarian society, where you get up when the sun comes up, you go home when the sun comes down, and you let sort of the natural rhythms of the seasons in the year and the time sort of draw you into this. And now we do everything we can to sort of subvert these natural rhythms. We have alarm clocks to wake us up whenever, and we dark out the windows and sleep in the middle of the day or stay up all night. So I'm with you. Just this, but it's the intentionality here, I think, that comes with this. It's being drawn in together as a uniting moment for these people, but they're not just being united together, they are being united together with God in this, right? And don't forget this. When this is done and this is past and we've moved on to something else, don't forget this. You're going to come back to this every year, and this is going to be a central part of who you are.
Yeah, and I think one of the key takeaways from this section for me is just what rhythms are saving you and reminding you of who you are, and reminding you to be part of a better story. As we've talked about, it feels like a time when people are saying, that faith is not for me, I'm going to go do something else in my life. It's like, okay, well then what rhythms are saving you? What are you part of? And for me, church is hard at times. It's a struggle to be in community with other people, but it's ultimately been a great blessing in my life, and I'm very thankful for it. And it's a group of people, as failed as we are, we're trying to live into these really great realities, and like remembering God's love and God's saving work in history and in our own lives. And if you decide that's not for you, okay, but then where are you going, and what rhythms are really helping you? What's helping to really be a blessing to you? My wife and I, when we had our first son, our first baby, only son, but when we had Carter, she was still working at her job, and it was kind of the typical job where you had to work 60 or 70 hours a week to just keep your head afloat. She was working really hard. But we had a few things that we were finishing up, paying off, that we were just like really hoping to strive to get to. And so for about a year and a half, she did that while also, and it was, I would say, the most stressful part of our marriage. There was just a lot going on there. And there was a point where I realized, like, this is how people drift apart. I felt that in my head, and I think she felt that also, just like the busyness, and she was working really hard. And I remember thinking, I think we got to do something about this. And so we came up with, because date nights can be hard. I mean, I think some therapists say, like, oh yeah, do a date night once a week. It's like, we have a lot of great childcare help, but like, who can do that? And so what we came up with is on Thursday nights, we have wine night. We have some wine together. And that is, just a little bit of wine.
I like it.
Shackman family secret. And
not anymore.
Not anymore. It's now out to the YouTube world. But that is now something that I look forward to so much. And it's like, it's a rhythm, it's an anchor to our week. It's when we decompress, our phones are out of the room. We just have like a conversation about like parenting and what's going on, the deeper things of life. And I look forward to it so much, and I'm so thankful for it. And I would say that is a rhythm that has saved me. And there was a time I was doing some counseling with somebody who was in just a difficult marriage situation, and I shared that with this individual, and you could just tell, like, he didn't think his wife would want to do that with him. And that just broke my heart. And I just think sometimes we're so busy and doing all this stuff that there's not any rhythms that anchor us to the things that matter the most. Like nobody gets married hoping for a divorce, right? And like what rhythms are helping to save you and help you to remember like what is most important and most sacred about your life. And that's something that I think is really interesting about much of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, is just the times when God just stops. Says, all right, let me tell you, like every 3rd month, you guys need to remember like what this is like, and this is how it's going to be. This is how you're going to celebrate. And I think rhythmless society and a celebrationless society, like we don't really just celebrate as much as we probably should.
Well, we don't just stop everything to celebrate. I think one of the things that's really important that you touch on is it's the way that in the first 5 books we see God working with Israel to organize their year around him. That there are celebrations, there are festivals, there are moments of rest, there are moments of reflection, there are moments of connection. What we wear and what we eat and how we worship, it becomes this holistic, comprehensive thing for them. That there is not a part of their lives that is too private, too personal, too whatever for God. God is involved in all of these things. And in our context, I think what we have done is we have perfected the art of bracketing or putting things into boxes. And we go, my spiritual life is over here, my marriage is over here, my work is over here, my education is over here, my hobbies and enjoyment over here. Everything is in a box, and things aren't supposed to commingle. And we end up then with these very sort of divided, bifurcated, sort of compartmentalized lives.
Bifurcated, wow.
Right?
That's worth at least $1.
There you go. These lives that are very compartmentalized, and there's no overlap. And then we sort of look at each other and go, why do we feel so disjointed, so disconnected? It's because we've created our lives to be very disconnected, right? And maybe part of that is we feel like we have more control, which is such an illusion. But here in Exodus, with the Passover in many ways kind of starting this conversation, starting this idea, we move into the space of God saying, everything you do is related to me. I am here. I am present. I am present in all of these things. What does it look like to build your life around God instead of God sort of being part of your life? And it starts here. And I think it's a really powerful expression of what God intended his relationship with the people to be. Is very involved.
Yeah, and then, just how are you remembering God and remembering your most sacred responsibilities? What rhythms help to lead you to that? I was reading an article several years ago about how of the 7 deadly sins, sloth might be the one that Americans struggle with the most. And I was like, what? That doesn't make any sense, because we're like ridiculously hard workers. And this author went on to define sloth as ignoring the most important thing. And you could do it in a million ways. It could be that you're just laying on a couch and sleeping all day. Or it could be that you're working 80 hours a week and ignoring your kids, ignoring your spouse, ignoring like your best friends, your responsibilities. And so sloth cuts both ways. It's just, what are you doing to ignore the thing that is most important to you? And I just think the way that God structures the life of a Jewish believer in this time, like that has a real important word for us. Okay, the specifics. You need to slow down. Your animals can't work. Like just the specifics of it. And you need to have this because you need to rest in grace. And this is a deepening reality. The Passover, I think, is important, but I also was preparing this, doing some reading about how the Passover and communion are distinct, the communion celebration. I'd love for you to comment a little about that they're similar, and we see echoes and history in it, but the differences that I think are important for us to recognize.
Well, I mean, certainly, according to the Gospels, what becomes the Lord's Supper or communion comes out of a Passover celebration. But it is a very small part of that celebration. So here Jesus is, with his disciples, they're having this much larger meal, and we get a glimpse here of what that meal would have entailed. Lamb, bitter herbs, these other elements that represented, salty water as things, develop out. These different elements that are designed to draw the people into the whole of this experience, right? And what we have done there with communion is we pulled out sort of 2 key elements. Wine and unleavened bread, and they take on new meaning. I don't think meaning that is divorced completely from their original meaning. But the point of the unleavened bread was, I think in Passover, is not what it's become for us, right? For us, it becomes the body and blood of Jesus Christ, which is a radical reimagining of this moment. It probably evokes some of the ideas and imagery, firstborn, slaughter, firstborn, blood as indicative of sort of this relationship. But let's also, I think, be honest too. I mean, there's a lot of, should we say, variety in the way that Christians practice communion, from very high church practice where there's a sanctification process. There is a very ritualistic process that goes into that, where everyone in the room is sort of drawn in to this very specific space, to very sort of informal or less formal, sort of lower church. Again, don't always love this language, but for the sake of our conversation, informal, crackers and juice. Again, drawing us into the imagery, but it's become something different. And I think on the one hand, there's the DNA of the Passover in what we do, but it's not the same thing. And I'm torn, to be honest with you, because there are definitely times, and I've really kind of come to this point where I'm grieved by the fact that Christianity and Judaism are so deeply severed into these 2 traditions, because I feel like there's so much for us to learn from Judaism. whether it's the implementation and the practice of Passover, or the way the rhythms of the Torah still fit into the fabric, was woven into the fabric of Jewish life, or the fact that we have rabbis who have been studying the same scriptures that we hold to be holy for thousands of years, and we have thousands of years of understanding that we've cut ourselves off from because it's not Christian. So I'm grieved at that separation, but at the same time, I also recognize that we have made decisions based on faith commitments that have taken us in different directions. And it's the recognition of Judaism as our heritage, while also recognizing that what we do is connected, but it has its own meaning. And for us to really embrace that meaning as well. Not necessarily as superior, but as other and different. And saying, here we are moving in this new direction and saying, this bread represents his body, this fruit of the vine represents his blood. And that is as important to our self-definition, and should be as important to our self-definition, as Passover is to a Jewish self-definition.
Yeah, and just as I think about this, the specifics that are given and the large like context of the meal, and then there's so, like you said, it was a small part of it that we are connecting to, and it, I think, is important to have that somewhat in the backdrop to recognize just what it is that you're doing. I think something that as I reread this passage and just thought about it a bit, especially as just thinking of the way that we take communion, just the bloodiness of it, the death that is here, and then obviously in the death of Christ as well. Like I just, every once in a while, someone will share a thought on communion about how Jesus suffered and things like that. But to really, I don't know, it just helps it come to life perhaps in a way that you don't want it to, but just like the way that it really is it's a good thing, but it's like a medicine you have to take, but you don't want to. It's tough.
Well, and I think it's also the challenge that we oftentimes have with the way that we sanitize the narrative. So, last time we talked a little bit about a God who, exists simultaneously in these very unsanitary spaces, in the midst of sort of all this bloodshed of lambs and others, and in the midst of the bloodshed of his son. So he's in the midst of these very unsanitary places, but is also sort of holy and other and removed. And I think part of what we end up doing, if we're not careful, is we sanitize. Whether we sanitize our reading of the Passover, as we're sort of very quickly kind of transitioning our reading of the Passover as a sort of foreshadowing into communion, or the way that we talk about communion in a way that doesn't really draw us into the pain and suffering and bloodshed. And it's a really uncomfortable space to be in. Really recognizing with sort of this really painful, awful, excruciating, terrible, gruesome, just gross, honestly, foul experience. And yet we come through that experience, right? And it's kind of hard to talk about Jesus's blood without talking about Jesus's blood. It's sort of hard to talk about the Passover without talking about the really messy part of this. And I think it's the sanitizing that we sometimes do that I think is it disconnects us, I think, from what's really happening here, and it disconnects us from that pain and suffering.
Yeah, and I think just the way that we've made it, quick and efficient. I think of, back in the day, or even still church today, have wine, which just the fact that you have to drink it would just make you reflect on the taste a little bit more than the grape. Like grape juice goes down easy, right? It's it's a little easier, and I'm not promoting wine. I've talked about wine enough on this talk, but
sounds like you're promoting wine on this podcast. Is it sponsored? Is this sponsored by wine?
It's sponsored by
Carlos Rossi?
No sponsors. But I remember a story. A professor of mine, when I was a student at Pepperdine, he had a guest lecturer, N.T. Wright, who's one of the most famous living theologians, and he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, so he's definitely
Very high church,
a
yeah.
high church style.
Anglican, yeah.
And he attended the Church of Christ service that my professor friend was at, and he said he heard N.T. Wright lean over to his wife during the communion portion, and he said, "My goodness, are we about to take Holy Communion right now?" It's just like, what? We're about to, this very informal feeling thing, and someone gets up and tells a story about mowing the lawn, and then like we're gonna like
Yes.
turn this in. And
Yeah.
I hope that out of this time of COVID, something that we can all get back to is just a deep appreciation for communion, what it is that we're doing when we're together. It's been a blessing to have the technology to share in it, even not being together, and even just thinking of people taking it with me in other living rooms around LA and beyond is very encouraging to me. But I hope that we really have a shared sense of the power of what it is that we're missing, not being together and taking it, because oftentimes it's just this thing that we're doing out of efficiency's sake and not really putting ourselves where we need to be.
Yeah. There's nothing particularly efficient about the Passover.
Yeah.
And there was nothing efficient about the crucifixion.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, back to the idea of rhythms and slowing down. When you slow down in these moments, you are forced to reckon with the reality. If you speed through something, if you move efficiently through something, you can avoid the realities of that. You can look past that. But when you slow down, you have no choice but to really grapple with the reality. And I think while we would like to avoid that pain, I think we're called to sort of sit in that pain and understand it as it shapes who we are.
Yeah. And so, this deep roots of this. And then we'll talk briefly about the crossing of the Red Sea, which I got to give Philip some credit for this set, which represents us going through these walls of water. And it's interesting to just even seeing that. It's I think something that is one of the images that is maybe most popular coming from Scripture.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
And it's representative of God releasing people from slavery. It says that people walked across, and it says dry ground. I once in a sermon told the story that a rabbi tells about this passage that says that someone is walking across and is angry about the mud getting on his shoes. And it's the angriest email I've ever gotten from somebody, which hopefully that never gets topped. But they said, it says dry ground in my Bible. And it was like, it's not my story, it's someone else's story. But it's getting to this idea of that you're walking across and this miracle is happening all around you and you aren't able to see the miracle. You're focused on the dirt. So let's say it was dry ground getting in someone's shoes. But it's, I think, a really powerful image that, again, just like the story of the Passover, definitely has echoes in the New Testament. And it gives you so much understanding as you think about a group of people being redeemed through the water, that God saves people through water, I think is a really powerful image.
Oh, I mean, there's so much wonderful foreshadowing imagery here. It's water that saves, but the same water that saves is also the water that destroys, right? It's this moment of freedom and, this Passover celebration of that, but the backside of that celebration is death and destruction, right? So it's out of death and destruction come life, into life, away from death and destruction, right? So it's this interesting sort of coming together. And, Pharaoh, in the midst of all of this, just can't quite seem to let it go, or can't quite seem to move beyond what has been taking place, or to step back. Here we go. The people have packed up. It's, essentially he says, get out of here. Take everything you have, leave now, don't pass go, don't collect $200, just get out of my land. I don't want to see you ever again. And as they get away from Egypt a bit, Pharaoh kind of looks and goes, shoot, did I make a bad choice here? Like, maybe we really should go get them. And look, they're wandering around in the wilderness. They don't even know what they're doing. Like, let's go back and get our labor force. And is sort of drawn right into this Red Sea experience, which, I mean, again, it's there's so much tragedy woven into this. Now, do I feel particularly bad for Pharaoh? No, but there is that part of the story, I think, that sometimes we don't wrestle with enough. Just the Israelites don't leave without a cost. The cost is the oppressor, absolutely. But I think that again kind of highlights just how damaging these experiences for the oppressed are, as well as sort of how damaging they can be for the oppressor. And a God who desires both the oppressor and the oppressed, both the oppressed and the oppressor to go free. And I think God is beckoning Pharaoh into freedom from oppression, from oppressor, and Pharaoh is just not interested.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's a really powerful message for us as we're being called away from oppression to freedom, that for many of us who find ourselves in positions of power and really in positions of oppression, we say we want freedom, but we really don't, because of what that means we're giving up. And I think Pharaoh draws us right back into that.
Yeah, that's a great thought to end on. We're coming here towards the end. That was a brilliant way to put it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So I'll just nod my head in approval and say that was wonderful. I mean, yeah, I think that it's both sides of that are really important to consider. That as you think about hearing the voices of the oppressed, it can be threatening at first. It can be like, oh, I or I'm not that bad, or you can kind of put up all these you have these impulses to either defend yourself or just defend the system. And the question is, at what cost to you and at what cost? It's not just those people. There's a cost on both sides, both ends of that equation. And we'll continue to see just how hard it is then to walk in freedom, because the Israelites get out there and it's not all that pretty on the other side. I think there's things in all of our lives where, if I just get to here, then I'm just going to be happy. And we see that that's not true either. We'll see that as the narrative continues to unfold. Thank you again, as always, for joining us. It's a blessing to work through this with you.
Thank you.
Justin, thank you for your insights. If you have any questions about what we discussed tonight, you are welcome to email me, Brian with a Y at glendale.church. We also have a prayer call that starts right now, basically. And if you ever want the information for that, I can give you the Zoom link, and we would love it if you would participate with us. Let me say a word of prayer as we close. God, we are thankful for the Passover and what it teaches us. We're thankful for the story of the Israelites and Pharaoh, the ways that we need to recognize the ways we identify with Pharaoh and the Israelites. May we hear the voice of the oppressed and do something about it so that all may be liberated and free. God, may we seek your justice more and more in the world. May we be advocates for the voiceless, and may we find ways to stand in solidarity with those who are oppressed. Your Son, Jesus, I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thank you.